Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Chapter 5 of his work, The Categories, where Aristotle ostensibly is discussing substance, there's a very interesting and, in some respects, important side discussion that comes up that has to do not with substances per se, but rather with what you could call today linguistic or mental expressions that relate ultimately to substances. Aristotle is using the term in Greek logos, which means anything from speech itself to argument to reason. But in this particular case, it's better to translate it as something like statement, and we'll give some examples of that in a bit. The other term that he's using is typically translated as opinions, and that works all right. We could also say beliefs or judgments, even assumptions. Assertions that we make in our head. Statements could also be, linguistic assertions, saying something is the case or is not the case. And the word for this is doxa. Doxai is the plural. It's the same word that we get, we translate sometimes in other contexts as reputation or, even glory or something like that. But in this case, it has to do with what we deem to be the case, what we think, what we assume. What we tell ourselves is another way we could put it. So the relationship between those things and what Aristotle is calling enantia, or that's in the Greek, contraries. Contraries are things like black and white, hot and cold, good and bad. They're at opposite ends of a spectrum perhaps, or perhaps there's nothing else in between. Definitely not the case with black and white or hot and cold for Aristotle. No, not for good or bad either, but you get the idea. So why is this coming up in the first place? Well, it's coming up in the course of a discussion where Aristotle is particularly keen to talk about the fact that substances admit of or accept contraries. So, for example, this book, the pages are white. Presumably, these are actually made with pretty good paper, I think like acid-free and all that. But, let this book sit for a couple hundred years, and the colors of the pages should probably change, right? If they don't, I'd be very surprised. Although, of course, I won't be around to see that. In part because the processes of change are happening more quickly to this body that I have, right? That's a process of change as well, going from young to old. Right now I'm kind of in the middle point. Hopefully I'll last long enough to be old. Now, what is the context here? So Aristotle has said that substances admit of contraries. That is, substances themselves can change by losing one of the contraries and taking on another of them. So I have a prop here that I'm going to be using for this, a chair, right? This is the chair that I sit at when I edit my videos. It's red. It's wooden. It's, at this point in time, not broken. Maybe by the time that somebody watches this video, far down the line, it will in fact be no more, or will have changed its color. Right now it's a very nice. This is an IKEA piece, right? Very nice red, but presumably over time, the paint, something will happen to it. We could decide we want to repaint it, and make it black or white or whatever. You get the idea. Substances themselves admit of changes. My body can be healthy right now, and then, earlier this week I was actually sick, and maybe next week I'll be sick again. So these are the way substances work, and the way contraries exist in substances. Now, what Aristotle says is that it's only substances that admit of changes like that, admit of contraries, where they can accept opposed contraries, not at the same time, so the same thing can't be both healthy and sick at the same time, at least not in the same respect, but it can be healthy at one time and sick at another time. And it still remains, say, human being, or guinea pig, or octopus, or houseplant. Now, are substances really the only thing that admit of contraries that way? Aristotle says, somebody could raise an objection. What could they raise the objection of? Well, of statements and opinions. Notice that it's not just any contraries that he's going to discuss here, because there's some that just, don't really make that much sense, unless we're talking in a very metaphorical way, right? We can say statements seem to be able to admit one kind of contrariness. Not to be black and white, or to be good or bad, or to be hot or cold. I mean, we can talk about statements in those ways, but there we're again, being rather metaphorical. We're not using the words in the same sense as we would in other cases. But what about truth and falsity? It certainly seems like statements are able to be, at least some statements, to be both true and false. Some statements can't. Some statements, like a bachelor is an unmarried male, that is what we call a tautology. It's always true, right? You don't even have to have bachelors or males or anything like that. It's been defined that way, and it's just always going to be the case. Complex statements that contain some sort of absurdity, which are always false, would be another case where you can't have this sort of change as well, some sort of inherent contradiction. But it seems like there's a lot of statements that can be both true and false, doesn't it? So we're going to use this prop in just a moment, but think about this. Dr. Sadler is wearing a black shirt and a yellow tie. It's true at this moment. You probably think that it's true while you're watching this video, but who knows? Maybe after I shoot this, I go and I change into a green shirt with a red tie. And suddenly the statement is false. So what about this? He sits. In this case, Dr. Sadler sits. Got a chair right here. Plunk it down. He sits. It's a false statement right now. Now it's a true statement. Now it's false again. Now it's true. What about when I'm halfway here? Well, don't worry about that too much, yeah? That's sort of like in the process of changing from being true to false. So if we look at it this way, then it does seem as if the statement is true at one point and then loses its truth and accepts falsity as part of that statement, something that can be predicated of the statement, right? He sits is a false statement. So it looks like the statement itself is undergoing change, accepting a contrary, rejecting the other, getting rid of that contrary, accepting the other one back in. So Aristotle says that's the wrong way to look at it. It's not the statement itself that is changing. And he says the same thing, by the way, holds for opinion. Because in part, Aristotle tends to think of statements and opinions, linguistic expressions, and their mental correlates as essentially being the same thing, one being external, one being internal. So it's not the statement that changes, it's something else. What is the something else? Well, you could say, the disposition of my body, or at least, part of my body, my posterior, in relation to this thing we call a chair, or anything else that I might happen to sit on. If I were to sit on the floor, right? Or try to sit on the ledge of the chalkboard. Probably wouldn't work for very long. That would not be a true statement for very long, right? So it's not the statement itself that changes. It's the something else, what it is that the statement is telling us about, what it's referring to. And this could hold even for imaginary things. You know, Mickey Mouse is a jerk, right? You go and watch the cartoon, and you're like, yeah, Mickey Mouse really is a jerk. Look at how he treats Goofy or Donald Duck. And then, maybe you watch another cartoon, and you're like, that Mickey's not such a bad guy after all. Or bad mouse, or bad being, whatever he is. Bad imaginary thing. It's quite possible to say things, statements about things that don't exist. So the statement itself doesn't undergo the change. What does undergo the change? In this case, for example, a substance, my body in relation to the chair. Aristotle will go on and say nothing can actually change statements or opinions. That's a weird thing to say that I imagine probably throws a few readers off. He doesn't mean that in the sense of, we never change our minds about things, so that if I, think that this is a red chair, and then I find out that I actually have red-green color blindness, and it's really a green chair. And somebody demonstrates that to me, say by showing me the spectra of the light waves or something along those lines. It's not that I wouldn't possibly change my opinion about it, but when we say change my opinion, we don't mean that I'm actually changing that opinion itself. We, in its what it is to be an opinion, we're saying that I get rid of that opinion and add a different one in its place. So it's a little bit of an imprecise way of talking about things. If we were, and it's probably easier to think about this in terms of statements, if we were to change a statement and say, this is a red chair, and then change the statement to this is a green chair, what we've actually done is created a new, different statement. We haven't changed the original statement. We've just taken that one off the table. That one is still what it is. This is a red chair. So we don't change statements or opinions in themselves as the statement or opinion that they are. You might say, well, what about when we clarify? We say, this is a red chair as it appears to me. That's a different statement again. That's not the same thing as the original statement. So there's really two important upshots of this. One is that, as it turns out, statements and opinions are not a counterexample to Aristotle's position that it's only substances that admit of contraries in the way that they do. And the other thing is, we know something now a little bit more, at least about how Aristotle thinks about it, about truth and falsity as things that can be predicated of opinions or statements. They don't work quite the same way as red and green, or spicy and sour, or, although those aren't actually opposites for Aristotle, but you get the idea. Good and bad, hot and cold, tall and short, any of these sorts of things. Truth and falsity work in a somewhat different way and require some reference to the relationship between linguistic or mental things and things, pragma, affairs, out there in reality, or at least imagined out there in reality.